Okay, hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. I think this is going to be the second of, I think, 4 videos that I'm going to try and do this week. So bear with me if I'm seeming even less hinged than usual. Trying to do a lot this week. Very grateful that you all are here. Today we're going to do sort of a 2020 year in review. And also, I realized just in that half hour coming up to this, that this is actually kind of a good example of what I do on the patrons only newscasts. Instead of just covering one issue in depth, what I do is I try to bounce around a whole bunch of other things and try to cover as many things as possible. And of course, reviewing 2020, this sort of year of all nightmare years requires bouncing around to a different number of different topics that are important to this channel. And this is an indication of what you can get if you sign up for the patrons, if you sign up on Patreon, my crowdfunding thing, which is the reason why I'm doing so much content this week in an effort to convince more people to do that and to vote on what this channel's next big project will be. Before we get into this insane presentation, there's a lot going on here. Who knows? Maybe I'll run through all of it in 20 minutes. Maybe it'll take an hour. I don't know. But however long that takes, at the end of that, we then just go to question and answer. I just exclusively respond to stuff in the chat, which you may have noticed, if you're new here, there is a live chat that you can participate in. We encourage things to get as heated as they need to be. You're welcome to be as abusive as you want to me, to my ideas, the things that I'm trying to say. We do not let you be abusive to other people in the chat. Really don't want to see, people ganging up on people because of their ideas. Don't want any kind of disruption of the chat. Sometimes you do have to keep asking the same question to get my attention once we get to the Q&A period. Basically, try not to disrupt the flow of the chat and be civil to each other. We have enforcement for this. Logo Cool Extreme is the moderator of the chat. There is no higher court of appeal. If Logo decides that you are being either abusive to other folks or just damaging to the flow of the chat, he will warn you. And then if you do not listen to his warning, he can put you on a timeout, or maybe he'll just block you entirely. That is entirely in Logo Cool Extreme's discretion. He is the chat moderator. It's a little loud out here in Brooklyn today, and I apologize for that, but I'll try to speak more loudly when things get more disruptive. I think they're cleaning the street as we speak. So during the presentation, please hold off on any super chats or questions for me because I won't see them. I don't have the mental bandwidth to dive into that. But once we start the Q&A, then of course, all super chats and questions are very welcome. And I'll try to engage with those questions from the end of this presentation until 2 o'clock, or about 2 hours from now, depending on the time where you are. It is noon. It's just after noon Eastern Standard Time here in Brooklyn. And let's launch into it. Let's launch into the 2020 year in review. It's been a very interesting year. Most of what I read books. That's something that I do. People talk about how Spain being on Twitter too much, or the internet has made it hard for them to read. It's actually made it hard for me to watch television. I don't watch as much serialized television as I used to, but I still read books all the time. And pretty much exclusively what I read is history and science fiction. And I think as a generalized theme this year, what we've seen is history, current events starting to look a lot more like science fiction. It's been a weird, from my perspective where I sit, it's just been this sort of weird bleed of concepts and ideas that used to be sort of fantasy, used to be science fiction, used to be far out there, all of a sudden becoming reality. Unfortunately, the way this has worked is that it seems that for the rich and powerful, it's been a year of fantasies coming true, And for the poor and the weakest among us, it's been more in the horror genre. What's happened this year? It's quite disturbing and interesting to see that when things get up in the air, when things get chaotic, when things get disrupted, it seems at this point anyway, and I think at many points, it's easiest for those with the most resources and the most power to come out best, whereas the weakest, whether we're talking about in any given society, those lower down the economic distribution, or as we're speaking in geopolitics, weaker elements like the Sahrawis in what is now much more conclusively Moroccan Western Sahara, or the Armenians, or I think, anyway, the people in Hong Kong, the people in Yemen, the people in Syria. This is one of the more disturbing trends that I think, as we already were talking about in the chat, especially for folks in the chat, especially for the young, which I would really no longer consider myself to be, but I think the majority of the folks in the chat are younger than I. It can be incredibly exciting what's been happening over 2020, just sort of watching the world become a little less. Things have been happening this year for sure. But I think it's really important to keep in mind, and I get that excitement, I get that interest. It certainly kept me engaged. But I think it's important to consider just what the real world costs of these changes are, and what the real world costs of this are likely to continue to be. So I suppose let's just launch into it. COVID-19, the pandemic, coronavirus. I made a decision very early on with the coronavirus thing that I'm very pleased that I stuck to. Maybe to my detriment. I think I could tell that the coronavirus thing was likely to be a much bigger deal than forecast from, I think, earlier this year than most. But I didn't make any content about it, mostly because I'm not a medical expert. I'm not a public health expert. I do read a lot of history, and I think I probably have a slightly better sense than many about sort of just the historical basis for pandemics and disease in human history, and just how important it almost always has been, even though it hasn't for the past century. So I think I have a little bit of perspective there. But as far as how an mRNA vaccine is going to treat you, the appropriate way to tot up, casualties, what a case fatality rate is, what a IFR. I mean, it's always been very mystifying to me. And much like with finance, where I think a lot of people, even though it is mystifying to them, they decide to make really firm pronouncements. I have not been making any firm pronouncements about what I think about coronavirus, what I think the right way to handle things is. Lockdowns, it's just not my area of expertise. And I've avoided talking about it and making much commentary on it. I've talked a lot about its effects on the oil market, on markets, on geopolitics. I just don't have much to say about the science of it because I don't know science. But I think after a year of looking at this stuff, I think one of my biggest takeaways is actually that this could have been so much worse. And I think that's obviously, with I believe now millions dead worldwide and over 300,000 dead in the United States, it may seem ridiculous to say that it could have been so much worse, but it absolutely could have, especially considering the extreme mismanagement that the United States most famously and most shockingly and disturbingly has gone through. And the way that, the rest of the world hasn't handled it as well as it should have. So what this has been a tremendous wake-up call and a tremendous indicator of how poorly we can handle tremendously important things in public health and just general governance if we have somebody who's completely incapable at the core of the system, as we did in the United States with Donald Trump. I think there's a lot of people who want to go nuts with sort of, the US response wasn't that bad. Of course, to say that, you have to exclusively cherry pick some of the worst run countries in Europe to make those comparisons seem to work. There have been multiple points during the summer where the EU's during the year where the EU's case numbers and death numbers briefly spiked to points that were just normal in the United States. And folks would say, oh, look, US and Europe are exactly the same. I think basic math and basic chart literacy would show you that those comparisons that make the US look okay compared to Europe are frankly idiocy. And they also completely leave out the fact that the United States is vastly richer than Europe, for the love of God. I mean, we are vastly richer than Europe. I mean, if you tot up all the countries together, European countries together, supposedly you can get GDP figures that are larger than those of the United States. However, the United States has one system that has a public health bureaucracy, that has a Centers of Disease Control, that all of that GDP potential funnels into. The EU bureaucracy, though growing, is nowhere near as large as its GDP, collective aggregate GDP would suggest. So the United States and Donald Trump's failure over this past year has been just so extreme. And the costs for that have actually been relatively minor. That's, I think, something we can honestly be grateful for as a world, because we've got just saw a super chat. Please hold over the super chat so I can respond to all of them until I get out of the presentation phase. But thank you, Anan. Will you ever do a video on Hong Kong in the future? I would say probably not. I'll try to get back to that when we get back to the Q&A. Where was I? Talking about just the extraordinary US failure and how this has actually been kind of a lucky miss. To have such catastrophic failure of US government and governance in Europe as well. I'm not saying that everybody else did an amazing job. I think that there are many countries in Asia that did an amazing job, and not just, oh, people with, these Asians with their natural submissiveness and their Confucian culture, not to dive into that racist horse shit. Like, it has Australia and New Zealand got a deep history of Confucianism. These countries in Asia have just held on to something that the US and Europe has abandoned, which is the idea of the common good. And that's, I think that's certainly a lesson for the US and Europe, but not an excuse for a catastrophic failure. But the fact that we made it through this, or at least seem to be making it through this with only a few millions dead, is actually pretty spectacular. For somebody who reads a lot of science fiction, who focuses a lot on public policy, and has been aware of this pandemic issue for quite some time, we got off real easy with just a few millions dead. We are now better situated when the next horror show comes down the pike. We are now better situated when the real pandemic comes, because this is, I mean, it's horrible, but it's a 1% case fatality rate is not the kind of disaster that has been foretold. Foretold in films like Steven Soderbergh's Contagion, which is, I think, one of certainly worth watching and rewatching. Sort of astonishing how well it had predicted this pandemic. And another sort of positive thing about this is it's actually been, when I talk about the pandemic in the United States, I can be angry, I can be disappointed, I can talk about the depression, I can talk about personal depression, just the isolating nature, I can talk about anything related to coronavirus, I can talk about hope, I can talk about positivity. And what's interesting about it is that it is a universal story. There is, the responses of governments and societies may vary, but everybody in the world, everybody on this chat has the same story. It's something that all of us all over the world have in common. I don't think there's enough focus on that. That is in one way sort of science fiction becoming reality, because it in horrifying ways, the fact that this is the first truly society scraping. Well, of course, AIDS, of course, but no, AIDS didn't have the rapidity of this. But this is a new dynamic that was long forecast, that was long science fiction, this sort of jet travel driven pandemic that goes everywhere, is a huge unifying element for all of humanity. We have all had essentially the same experience in 2020. And I think that that sort of unified human experience is something that we'll have more of as the years wear on. The internet's making that happen, entertainment's making that happen, English language spread is making that happen. And it's a really fascinating dynamic, and I think an aspect of the coronavirus pandemic that has not been focused on enough. This truly unified, and it's not like, I mean, there have absolutely been pandemics. The Spanish flu in 1918, 1919 was absolutely a worldwide pandemic, but there wasn't enough of a common cultural space in the world back then. India was actually the hardest hit country by the Spanish flu, is my understanding. But just the linked understanding of this all being something that happened together. It was more spread out in time, more spread out in understanding. So yeah, I think, and you can think the 2008 financial crisis was definitely a unified world phenomenon as well, but it had completely different effects in different places. And yes, coronavirus is having completely different effects in different places, and will continue to develop along that pattern. But just to have everybody in the world from March dealing with the same challenge in their everyday lives, not like a financial crisis that sort of filters down at different rates in different places and different times. I think that's kind of a big deal, and I think that is kind of sci-fi becoming real in weird ways. Moving on to Turkey. Turkey is absolutely something that really knits together a lot of certainly a lot that this channel covers, but it knits together a lot of just sort of shifting narratives in the way that power is distributed in the world, in the way that the world works, the way that the Middle East is going to work, the way that Europe is going to work. I mean, it's tremendously significant, and because of Erdogan's power, not just Erdogan's power, but also Turkey's power. Turkey has been a significant military player, really since, I mean, it's debatable whether they were in World War One. I think their collapse was quite spectacular. But from the time of Ataturk going on, certainly by World War II, and even though Turkey didn't join World War II, they did a massive ramp up in mobilization and sort of their general military industrial complex. Turkey has been a very powerful military, cultural, economic force for quite some time. 2020 was sort of a coming out party for Turkey. I mean, I think I ran a video, I did a live chat earlier this year called Ottoman Dreams. Because I think certainly as long as Erdogan's been in power, or maybe it, came in 5 years after he was in power, but just this concept of Ottoman revanchism or Ottoman dreams, or this idea that the Turkish Republic, being the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, was somehow going to restore this Ottoman past, or at least this Ottoman glory. This was an idea that, frankly, I joined with people in laughing at before 2020. I still think it's kind of laughable, frankly. But in 2020, there were dramatic shifts in multiple theaters of conflict surrounding Turkey that made that old sort of fantasy of an Ottoman rebirth look a lot more serious and a lot more concrete. I think this is part of the pandemic. The coronavirus thing has pushed a lot of things forward, not just in terms of sort of science fiction or fantasy, but in terms of just forecasts, things that people always believed were going to happen. Which it's all on a spectrum. The forecasts of a serious multilateral agency, and the imaginings of some bearded psycho in a basement somewhere that come under the rubric of science fiction, they're not so different. Those things. It's just on a different spectrum, a different timeline. And one of the main ones that has been pushed forward this year in ways that have been quite dramatic was multipolarity. And I think meaning the world was seen as sort of bipolar during the Cold War. It had two poles. It had the United States and the Soviet Union. Since the 90s, we had a unipolar moment where there was just one pole of power. And I think for the past 2 decades, people have been talking a lot about how we're dissolving back into a multipolar situation, like we haven't really had since before World War One. And well, arguably in the interim, I lean towards the explanation that I lean towards the interpretation that World War One, World War Two, and the time in between is just one long period of chaos. But I could be wrong about that. But people have been forecasting for quite some time. The U.S. government came out in 2018 and basically said in its national defense strategy, we want the politics of the era before World War One, which is, of course, insane and would have been discussed more if Donald Trump hadn't been president. But this sort of long forecast multipolarity, the multipolar world, it looks much more real in 2020. And I think, interestingly, it's Turkey who's played a key part in sort of at least 3 or 4 separate theaters that make it look like that's more plausible. Turkey's been involved in Syria since 2016 in a sort of slow accretion of territories. But I would argue that in 2020, in a much ignored episode in, I think, February and March of 2020, Turkey asserted itself in Syria in a much more concrete way. I think what happened was the Syrian government dropped a couple missiles on some Turkish soldiers, killing, I think, dozens. I think the idea being, well, if Turkey, if we make things just a little more uncomfortable for Turkey, there'll be an outcry and they'll quickly withdraw. Mistaking Turkey's interests in its country next door for U.S. interests on the other side of the world, where the U.S. public certainly stopped the Bush administration from continuing and expanding its occupation of the Middle East, because the U.S. public was completely correct in that the United States has no viable interests in the Middle East. Whereas Turkey really does have viable interests in the Middle East. And what happened when Assad killed those couple dozen Turkish soldiers was Turkey rolled over Assad and took back something like half of the fruits of 6 months of Assad's offensives in a day or two. And I think very quickly changed the dynamics of the Syrian civil war into a very outright occupation by Turkey, and a sort of, really, I think it's sort of an evolving Berlin Wall situation. It is a Russo-Turkish Cold War that I think folks aren't particularly appreciating. And I think there's a lot of fantasy in the United States that will not become reality, that that we're somehow important or vital to what goes on in Syria now, when really it's a Russian-Turkish show. And it would actually be, if anyone in Washington, D.C. was sane, the United States would just pull out and let that be its own problem. In doing that, we wouldn't just save ourselves a shit ton of money. We would actually probably be doing the Syrian people a favor, because it is much easier to deal with a conflict between 2 than a conflict between 3. And with the third, the United States, being such a fantastically unreliable ally to anybody. I mean, we're really just chaotic shit stirrers in Syria. That's all we've been since 2011. And we've killed 500,000 people there. So maybe we should stop doing that. So that's Turkey in Syria. I mean, has really sort of asserted itself as not just the second fiddle to the United States doing its scut work, but actually one of the big deals there. I do not support Turkey's occupation of Syria. I think it's a bad idea for Turkey and for Syria in general. But from a mercenary United States perspective, I think it makes sense for us just to pull out and let Erdogan and Putin fight. Victory in Libya is really no other way to describe it. In May and June, at the beginning of this year, Turkey, in return for an unfortunate agreement between Libya and Turkey on Mediterranean gas, Turkey piled in Libya. And in so doing, they ended sort of strongman Khalifa Haftar's attempt to unseat the UN-approved government. This is something that Turkey did that I am unreservedly a fan of, and I think it was fantastic. It's important to emphasize in both of these cases, Libya and Syria, the thing that is making this fantasy of multipolarity look true or become true. Because, yeah, I mean, science fiction and fantasy can absolutely become reality. The thing that's making this true is not, unique bravery by Erdogan or unique new developments in Turkish power or anything like that. What's making it possible is that the United States destroyed both Syria and Libya, creating an open vacuum that practically begged for a more responsible power to take a hand. I don't believe that Turkey is the responsible power in Syria. I think that's probably, if anybody's responsible in Syria, it's Russia and Iran. But in Libya, Turkey absolutely is the responsible power stepping in to solve a problem. On a previous live chat, somebody asked me about the Libya Stabilization Act, a piece of legislation working its way through Congress. Didn't look to me like it was yet approved. I'm actually not a fan of the Libya Stabilization Act because it treats folks in Libya that support both the UN-approved government and Khalifa Haftar, the shitty strongman, as equivalent, and puts arms embargoes on both. So it would actually seek to dissuade Turkey from having the positive influence in Libya that it's already had. So yeah, anyway, victory in Libya. So this is, Turkey's Ottoman dreams coming true. And then, of course, there is Armenia, Azerbaijan. I've got, an hour of video on this talking about my deeply conflicted position here. I, as with most people, really didn't like seeing Turkey beating up on Armenians. That is not something that I am a fan of, as someone who, acknowledges the Armenian genocide and does not think that is a clever way for Turkey or Erdogan to position themselves. But there's no denying that from the domestic political perspective for Erdogan, this was a tremendous, tremendous victory. The parts of Azerbaijan that have been occupied by Armenia for 30 years have now almost entirely been returned to Azerbaijan, and Turkish support was vital to that. That's a big hit locally, and though I'm not entirely sold by this interpretation, you can argue very persuasively that actually Erdogan's actions there, it's not an argument you'll see very often, which is an indication of double standards, but you could argue very conclusively that Erdogan's actions helped the strictures of international law and the expectations of international law to be honored. You can check out my other videos to sort of on Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Nagorno-Karabakh to get more complicated reads on that. But yeah, I mean, there's no denying that it's been a banner year for Turkey's geopolitical position from a certain perspective. I would argue that Turkey is, especially in Syria, sort of writing checks that they may not be able to cash. It's funny, that analogy won't work in Turkey because I don't think Turkey has checks anymore. But I do think that Erdogan has sort of bitten off a little bit more than Turkey can chew because the economic situation in Turkey is just so dire, and he needs to distract folks and shore up his support among nationalists. But it's interesting. There's the classic Keynes quote. In the long term, this might not work out, but in the long term, we're all dead. Of course, was that 2 years ago? There was a famous Yemeni president named Saleh, who spent 30 years dancing on the heads of snakes, as he said, continuing to run his country in the face of really unfriendly geopolitics. Of course, Saleh did eventually end up assassinated a couple of years back. But I think Erdogan, who knows? Erdogan could do it for another decade, and might end up leaving Turkey in better shape. I can't. I'm done making predictions of Erdogan's failure and catastrophe. I remain tremendously suspicious and concerned about the position Erdogan has put Turkey in, but I'm not here to predict failure for Erdogan anymore. I've been wrong about that for way too long. So who knows? Another interesting thing that was always and I've said nothing about the Eastern Mediterranean thing because I believe it to be an incredible clown show where Erdogan is an irresponsible actor, but so is everybody else. You can see my video on that. Israel peace is a really interesting. Of course, even using the term peace is a weird thing, but there's no denying that the Abraham Accords put together by Trump and Kushner, folks that I do not like, have shifted things in the Middle East. They are not peace agreements. These countries were not going to war with each other. They are, in the case of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, these were countries that were already sort of affiliated with Israel in a fairly openly secret approach. But in the aggregate, adding in deals with Morocco and Sudan, I mean, this is in fact a big deal. I've got a number of videos talking about that, talking about why the UAE deal isn't a big deal, and then when the Sudan thing came down the pipe, being like, oh wait, maybe this is a big deal. And yeah, I mean, this is something that I did not believe was possible, and I'm still not sure it is possible. Let's be very clear. It's, I mean, who knows what these deals actually mean? There isn't much written down. Almost every country involved in these supposed deals has backed off of things that were supposedly promised. But the thing is, it is a real reorientation of the region. I think Israel has and the United States have brought it about by destroying Syria and Iraq, the countries that were most vocal in their opposition to Israel. And I think the fact that a lot of Arab countries have sort of gotten on board with, or at least a lot of the leaderships of a lot of Arab countries, not the Arab publics, have gotten on board with the idea that, well, I guess we'd better at least, make nice with Israel publicly so as to avoid being annihilated. Yeah, I'm not sure that says very great things about the United States or Israel or the way politics have been conducted in the Middle East, but there's no denying that things have changed dramatically in the Middle East, and that too is sort of. It was a long time. It looked completely fantastical, not NGOs forecasting, but more. Bearded loser in his mother's basement writing science fiction forecasting for there to be real regularization of ties between Israel and Arab countries. And all of a sudden in 2020, it seems to be a thing that's actually happening. And that is science fiction becoming reality. Saudi Arabia, sort of an interesting, it's been a very interesting year for Saudi Arabia. And also, I think you could say at the same time, very interesting for Saudi Arabia and the oil market and electric cars. It's sort of for Saudi Arabia, sort of the best of times and the worst of times. It's been quite extraordinary what happened with the oil market. In March, Saudi Arabia took I think it's been construed by many, and I think quite fairly, as an attempt to drive Russia out of business, or rather drive most competition out of business. And that was kind of striking for me because I sort of looked at that and I was like, it didn't work because Trump told them to stop. And the Saudis are as in hoc to Trump as Trump is to them. But it was very clarifying for me because it's a point I've said very publicly, and I still believe that Saudi Arabia is finished. The current governing system of Saudi Arabia will be done by 2030. But it really clarified sort of some intervening steps for me, because there will be, I don't think it'll be a Saudi Aramco, but I think there will be an Aramco for decades to come. I think that the state oil company of Saudi Arabia is a lot more viable looking than Exxon, or certainly the oil industries of any other country in the world, certainly a Venezuela or a Canada, but even a Russia and the United States. It's just so cheap to get the oil out of the ground. Of course, as I emphasize over and over again, being the cheapest place to get a commodity that not as many people want anymore means that you're going to get less money for it. So even though Aramco should be around for decades to come, the Saudi royal family that sort of sits in profit and takes the lion's share of the profits, it's not going to be so viable anymore when the profits are not as outsized. So it's very interesting watching Saudi Arabia navigate through the coronavirus dip in oil consumption, because it's clarifying to me that actually, well, yeah, I absolutely still believe that the current Saudi Arabian system is finished. But it is clarifying that, Saudi Arabia is going to be producing oil long after everybody else has stopped. And that's a good added detail in that process. What's been very interesting is watching one of MBS's plays work out a little bit better than I expected. I've been quite confident, and I think there are many who are still quite confident, that the US stock market bubble is a bubble, is insane, is completely unsustainable, and will lead to quite a serious crash that keeps not happening. It's quite ridiculous. And in talking about sort of fantasies becoming true for those with money, and for those, it actually horror stories coming true for those without. In the United States this year, what we've got now is sort of a K-shaped recovery. Are you familiar with the concept? I mean, people like to talk about a V-shaped recovery. If something bad happens, the economy goes down, and then boom, and then it goes up. It's a V-shaped recovery. But what I think we've got is a K-shaped recovery. So it comes down here, it goes down. And then for those with resources, with those with investments, with those with wealth, with those with knowledge work jobs that can be done remotely, we have actually, I think it's quite arguable that most people who went to college in the United States are dramatically richer this year than they were in former years. And then you've got the majority of the country, the sort of bottom 60%, who have a K shape, the other side of the K, going straight down. And it's quite disastrous. Saudi Arabia, because of the positioning that MBS has done, something that I've castigated them for, which is taking money out of the Saudi economy and pouring it into U.S. Securities investments, is very much part of that K, very much part of the successful leg of the K. And this is something that gets almost no coverage. And needs to be covered more by people who have more investment savvy than I do. There was a glimpse of it, though, of course, they left Saudi Arabia out of this, but I believe it was in September, it was revealed that there absolutely have been machinations, speculative machinations behind the technology sector's incredible success on the stock market this year. And the person behind those machinations was Maya Soshi's son of SoftBank. And those of you who are familiar with Maya Soshi's son of SoftBank, you know that his vision fund is bankrolled by Saudi Arabia. So the incredible boom in tech stocks and in stocks more generally in the United States has been driven by Saudi Arabia. And it's interesting because it's not just a question of them purchasing a ton of stock, though they have certainly done so. It's also a question of SoftBank's options strategies. And through those options strategies, they have succeeded, and I can't speak to exactly how that works. They have succeeded in further inflating this tech bubble in the United States. And that means that many of the investments that Saudi Arabia has made have been successful. Of course, what that does is that also adds another sort of accelerant to the catastrophe that Saudi Arabia's governing system will eventually experience. Whether it happens in 2021 or 2025 or 2026 or 2027, it'd be amazing if it took as long as 2025. It'd be a very fun 5 years here in New York City. The stock market in the United States is going to crash. A lot of these investments are going to become valueless. And then I think that very quickly means that a lot of the reserve currencies, a lot of the sort of bank accounts that, to dramatically oversimplify, a lot of the assets that the Saudi government relies on to keep borrowing money and make a case for its viability. When the U.S. market crashes, that case is going to instantly become a lot weaker, and everything's going to get a lot harder for everybody, but I believe Saudi Arabia more than anybody else. Are we reaching a point where Saudi Arabia, where the continuance of the U.S. tech and stock market boom is existential for Saudi Arabia? Arguably, we might be. So that's a sort of interesting dynamic to pay attention to. But at this point, talk about fantasies becoming real. I mean, this stock market, I think Jim Cramer famously had a column during the first tech boom when I was a stockbroker in the late 90s and early aughts. There was a famous Jim Cramer column, I think, that said Dow 30,000. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is going to hit 30,000. And that was laughable at that point. And I think the Dow in the first tech boom made it up to about 12,000 and then plummeted. And then in the 2008 made it up to about 15,000 and then plummeted. And then, in 2020, with all the economic destruction, the death and whatnot that it brought, we got Dow 30,000. That was a long-term fantasy, a long-term ridiculous concept that was realized in 2020. We've also seen peak oil demand. This is another concept, something that Saudi Arabia has to be very worried about. Forever and ever, the conventional wisdom was that oil would peak, the oil supply would peak. We'd basically get to a point where we ran out of oil, and then we'd all be screwed. And this interpretation of things was very much supported by how expensive oil got during China's rapid development in the first decade and a half of this century. So it became very plausible to look at oil supplies and say, holy shit, look how expensive these oil costs are. Look how they're only going to get more expensive. We're in terrible, terrible trouble. We're going to run out. What's become more and more what has looked more and more plausible to those who follow these things over the past 5 years is something called peak oil demand, which is the opposite thing. It's not running out of oil. It's running out of people who want to buy oil. So this time last year, I was saying, I see this. I see this as a real possibility. And I was and so were many, 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 many other people. But these many other people and myself were sort of seen as sort of kind of ridiculous. You're at the other end of it's absurd. It's never going to happen. Da, da, da. This year, and I still don't maintain that it's happened this year or it's already happened. That doesn't make sense to me. I think we're going to see larger levels of oil consumed. However, British Petroleum, I think it was British Petroleum, BP, whatever, it was a big multinational oil company, put out its own analysis saying we have already passed peak oil demand, that we are never going to use as much oil as we used in 2019. I don't believe that. I think that there's going to be the recovery. I hope the recovery is going to be robust enough that we might see higher oil consumption in 2022 or 2023 than 2019. But I do believe, but peak oil demand went from something that, that's never gonna happen, to you're crazy for believing that, to one of the biggest oil companies in the world saying, yeah, no, that's not gonna happen. That happened. That's some science fiction becoming real. In Wall Street and investing more generally, with Tesla, and a raft of other electric car companies, which are absolutely a bubble. There's Chinese electric car companies that are going crazy. I think NIO in particular seems nuts to me. Maybe BYD is a better bet, but Tesla, I think, is a valuable company. It's more valuable. I bought some Tesla stock like 10 years ago, and I'm not selling it because I believe it is much more valuable than when I paid it for it 10 years ago. However, I do think it's going to lose at least half its value. It's of today's value sometime soon. Regardless, though, the fact that Wall Street, that the public in general is willing to plow endless money into electric cars is a sign of the future happening. This was always one of the main bars to large-scale investment in renewable technology, climate amelioration stuff was, Wall Street's never going to get behind it and da-da-da. Well, it's funny because after 5 years of absolutely losing their shirt and losing shit tons of money by funneling it into the shale gas revolution in Texas, one of the dirty secrets of the shale gas revolution is, yes, it absolutely took U.S. oil production from 7 million barrels a day to 15 or 16 million barrels of oil a day. One of the dirty secrets is that nobody made any money. It was a bubble of investment. And with all the money that was thrown at it, yes, production went up, went up, and went up. We're sort of in the same situation with electric cars and I think other aspects of sort of green technology at this point. People are just shoveling money at it, and very few of them are going to get their money back. But the money that's being shoveled into them is making the future happen anyway, which is quite something. It is kind of a strange world that we're living in right now. And I got to say, it's most reminiscent to me of the year sitting in the United States of 9/11. It's sort of, because I remember in 9/11, I think there was a famous Onion article. For you youngsters, if you have not read every article in the Onion's post 9/11, I think it's September 20th or something, 2001, edition, track it down online and read everything in it. It is the most prophetic, brilliant piece of satire I have ever read in my life. But I do recall one of the articles in that Onion article was like, wow, we really wish life was a little less like an action blockbuster. That was sort of it's a lot less exciting when it's actually happening. And I think that's something that we've gone through on a much larger scale. But I think it's important to remember as a world, certainly in the United States. But I think it's important to remember that there are many countries that have been living sci-fi dystopia for quite some time. And this really struck me. This struck me so hard this morning as I was going through something on Twitter. I don't know. I think I retweeted it. It's like, the Terminator. You remember it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. Actually, maybe, I mean, for me, it's formative, but I guess the last really successful Terminator film came out in 1992. But it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's the films that I think first, anyway, I don't know if it first made Arnold Schwarzenegger famous, but certainly rocketed him to a new level. The Terminator film in 1982, and then the was it early 80s, and then the sequel in Terminator 2 in 1992, I'm pretty sure. And it forecast this dark future, post-apocalyptic future where there were all these robots that went around killing people, and they were there to the robots tried to wipe out humanity, and then they send Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, the killer robot, back in time to kill the leader of the human resistance when he's a child. If you have not seen Terminator 1 and Terminator 2, I highly recommend you do so. These are fantastic films. But they're also quite dark because there's all kinds of footage of people running away from killer death robots in the sky. And we're building that. That is part of the lived experience of Somalis, Yemenis, Pakistanis, Syrians, Iraqis, Libyans, Afghans, and that has been the lived experience. Because of the U.S. war machine, these countries have been living Terminator in some cases for 2 decades now. and that's some pretty horrifying stuff. I talked a bit about Libya, and it's interesting that Libya, there seems to be real progress towards peace in Libya. It's interesting, if you looked at this week's news in Libya, you had Haftar, the shitty strongman of the East, talking about how he was going to go to war against Turkey, which is frankly quite laughable. While at the same time, his Egyptian backers are meeting with the Turkish and UN supported government in Tripoli. Yeah, it seems like there's some real progress in Libya, and it's hard for me to not see that as there being real progress because the United States is not involved. Because in two conflicts where the United States is very involved, Yemen and Syria, saw almost no progress this year. Just an added layer of horror and destruction brought by the pandemic. The U.S. has provided a really embarrassing, buffoonish example of what happens when government isn't really paying attention during a pandemic, or the central government isn't paying much attention during a pandemic. In Syria and Yemen, we're getting the opportunity to see what happens with a pandemic when there's no real government at all on a lot of metrics. And that's quite horrifying. And I think Yemen and Syria, two countries that are very serious, very topics that I cover a lot on this channel. This is just horror after horror after horror. In Syria, probably the most important thing that happened this year after the failure of Assad's offensive in Idlib after Turkey got pissed off was probably the implementation of the horrifying U.S. Caesar sanctions. We are now starving Syria to death. It's truly disgusting. It is, because we couldn't overthrow, their leader. We're now trying to murder a country. It's disgusting. I don't have any, broader thing to say other than that. That's something that I had to mention in 2020, and it's an awful thing that we're doing. And in Yemen, it's also tremendously frustrating because, in Yemen, I felt like it was Yemen in 2020 was a tale of things that were always going to happen that never did. The Houthis were always going to take Marib. It's a town far enough out in the desert that if they do successfully take it, they really, really cut off Saudi access to the parts of the country that they claim to control. But it just never, it remained a meat grinder. It never actually happened. And then, of course, in the parts of Yemen where Saudi Arabia actually claims to control, the deals, it was sort of it seemed like every week, the official Saudi government based in Riyadh, the Saudi capital, the official Yemeni government, would make another deal with the Southern Transition Council, the militias that actually run the few parts of Yemen that are not run by the Houthis. That sort of, you look at the week's news from Yemen and it's, oh, they've made another deal. Oh, they've fallen apart again. Oh, they've fallen. It's quite sad. And it's an indication of sort of what a multipolar world offers to the weakest. And it ain't much. And it is it's just continued suffering of the weak that we should all be ashamed of, frankly. No. Another sort of aspect of multipolarity is, to be clear, I'm not 100% certain we're living in a multipolar world yet, but 2020 is definitely a world that looks more multipolar, that looks more transactional, that looks more based on the machinations of competing great powers rather than the United States sitting at the center and telling folks how it's going to be. I think the consequences we saw, when we had the chance, when we were able to lift our head up above water and take a look at what was going on in the world other than our own country's COVID catastrophes, it became pretty clear that the emerging multipolar world is not a good world for smaller countries, for weaker countries. I think in 2020, what we saw in 2020 most clearly is small countries that have weird statuses. small countries that relied upon stagnation, that relied upon nothing changing, that had weird statuses, that relied upon U.S. enforced stasis, all suffered. The Armenians controlled Nagorno-Karabakh, ethnically very Armenian part of Azerbaijan, and 6 or 7 provinces around it. Under international law, they were not supposed to do that. They were expected by UN resolutions to arrive at some kind of diplomatic solution with Azerbaijan. They refused to do so. I think the combination of fantasies that didn't work out, pressure from the Armenian diaspora everywhere, believing its own propaganda, what have you. And war broke out and they got crushed. That's what happened to Armenia. Western Sahara is a place that, ironically, has the opposite situation, relied on UN Security Council briefings, UN Security Council resolutions for its claims to independent existence, and relied on Algeria, a country with a lot of problems right now. Western Sahara was very dependent on U.S. patronage to have any kind of existence. And the U.S. decided to sell them down the river for the sake of a Moroccan Israeli, wow, sell them down the river. That's a really very grim turn of phrase. Presumably that's slavery related, right? Thanks. Anyway, the United States, under Trump, opted to screw over Western Sahara in service to Morocco, who now, according to the U.S., has a complete Western Sahara. So Morocco would make a deal with Israel. So yeah, it's rough out there for countries that rely on the status quo. They relied on the status quo under U.S. unipolarity. And of course, the best example would be Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a country that, Hong Kong was a colony of Britain until 1997, therefore developed much differently from China under Chairman Mao, Cultural Revolution, this, that, and the other thing. Ought to remain tremendously useful to China because it's the small sliver of China that has functioning rule of law, functioning courts, it's where Western investors or Japanese investors, it's where the world wants to do business with China. For the first 25 years or so first 23 years or so of its time back under China, under the one country, two systems approach, Hong Kong was left largely unmolested. With Donald Trump in power and with a worldwide pandemic to sort of provide cover, that independence has been crushed. Donald Trump decided, with the complete agreement of the Pentagon and way too many actors in U.S. politics, decided to launch a new Cold War and started to become very aggressive about China. And one of the first things China did, because of course this sort of thing makes them insecure, was to crush what it saw as a weakness. And they've been doing that in Xinjiang with a really horrific system of cultural genocide. And in Hong Kong, in a more sparing way, they've been crushing and persecuting democracy activists in Hong Kong. And yeah, it ain't great to be in an emerging multipolar world. It ain't great to be a country or a jurisdiction or a region or a people that relies on the status quo of U.S. power. And that's sort of a grim note to end the 2020 year in review on, but it's been a grim year. So that's everything I wanted to go through. Oh my God, it took an hour. I'm sorry. I apologize for taking that long. Do we have questions for the next hour? It is Q&A around 2 o'clock. I will start. I'll basically just start pitching. Of course, I would like to pitch now as well. If you've enjoyed this presentation, this is basically what we do in the monthly patrons only newscast. We cover everything. We try to tie it together. What's different is for the patrons only newscast, there's never, I think, probably 50, 60 patrons and end up watching the presentation, but there's usually only 5 to 10 people there live. So in between each topic, I dive into the questions and I basically respond to every comment and question you might have. So that's sort of a perk of being in my crowdfunding thing. And also, for the next 3 days, if you sign up on Patreon, you will be able to vote on what my next huge project will be. I wrote two books and had 2 very long series, one called Everybody's Lying About Islam and one called Avoiding the British Empire. We're deciding what my next big project will be. Will it be Israel-Palestine? Will it be Afghanistan, India, Pakistan? Or will it be just sort of the general history of the US empire? People are voting on that for the next 3 days. You can sign up on Patreon to do that. Please do that. Okay, questions. Questions. Savage Opress says, nice title, Turkish Empire. I got proud. Yeah, I think it's been made clear to me. I think folks were talking about it in the comments. If I put Turkey anything into live chat, it tends to get viewed by more people. So thank you. I'm very grateful that folks from Turkey want to hear what I have to say about Turkey. Okay, questions. More Freedom Foundation, how has 2020 treated you? Lost anyone to the virus? I have not, though apparently I have, I believe my family's insurance agent died to the virus. It's very sad. He was a 75-year-old hardworking fella, but I've been very lucky in that it hasn't touched me much. Apparently, I did get exposed to somebody who had coronavirus over Christmas celebrations, but he's gone and gotten the test again, and that might have been a false negative, but who knows? But yeah, no, it's been weird. My mother had cancer this year, which was really not great, but she seems to be recovering, and we're all very grateful for that. And I've got to spend a ton of time with family this year, which probably wouldn't have been the case without coronavirus, and I'm grateful for that. So yeah, I'm mostly just very grateful, and I wish that everybody was as unscathed by coronavirus as I am. Question, Hafiz Farouk says, what is your stance on religion? Do you seek to believe in any religion? I think religion is great for those who like it. I think that it provides solace and community and this, that, and the other thing, and I think it's all fantastic. I think if I ever had kids, I'd probably, depending on whatever my wife would want, I would probably, would be okay with raising them in a church. But if it was the Episcopalian one, nice light drinking club with a religion habit. Yeah, as far as personal belief in a received religion, I don't have any personal ability to participate in anything like that. I read too much history and I'm too cynical by nature to believe that anybody got the perfect message of God. I think it's quite silly. I think exactly as silly as someone like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens claiming that they know exactly that God doesn't exist and this, that, and the other thing. I think it's all silly fanaticism. I think spirituality is an incredibly important part of everybody's life, and if you can find that in community or in scriptures you enjoy, that's fantastic. But yeah, as far as like the wanting to belong to a religion, that's not something I've ever wanted. Pirate King asks, More Freedom Foundation, you said that 2020 has been tough on those who rely on status quo. How will that affect Taiwan? That's a very good question. It's something I've been wondering about and not making videos about all year. Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know. Taiwan is absolutely a very interesting question. Taiwan is very cleverly distinguished itself during the coronavirus thing, has looked very sympathetic. I think Tsai Ing-wen, I think is that her name? I think is a very capable and charismatic leader. Maybe charismatic's not the term, but certainly makes a great case for Taiwan. And it's interesting because I made a video on Taiwan, gosh, 4 or 5 years ago. It's called "Arguing with Myself About Taiwan." It's sort of I see the Chinese perspective entirely. I mean, this is a place that was robbed from them by the Japanese and then became occupied by the losing side in a civil war. I mean, fuck them. But of course, that was 70 years ago. And Taiwan has developed in ways that, it is a free, independent democracy. Well, not technically independent. So I see both sides of that. And I got to say, China's behavior. So I saw both sides of that. And basically, this was at the outset. I think this is after Trump had been elected. If you just go to Mo Freedom Foundation Taiwan, it should come up. And I was pretty cool with the status quo, basically. I was like, let's just, be ambiguous about this forever. It'll be fine. And I got to say, after 4 years of China's reaction to Trump and seeking to become, more Trumpy than Trump in the way they deal with the outside world, I've become a lot less sympathetic to China. However, I mean, how much am I willing to see the U.S. invest in defending China? That's another very interesting question. Thankfully, I'm not going to have to make that decision, but still, that is quite perplexing. The thing about Taiwan, and this is a suspicion I have, I think there's been a lot of there's certainly been a lot of news stories talking about how Taiwan is not militarily prepared enough, and we have to give them tens of billions of dollars worth of equipment to defend themselves from China. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, whenever you read something like that, you're like, well, this is clearly defense industry propaganda, right? But I think there's sort of a flip side to what we've learned about China. You go back to like the Millennium Challenge thing that has pointed out that aircraft carriers and surface naval ships are bullshit. The Millennium Challenge was, I think, something that was run back in probably 2000, at least a decade and a half ago, where the U.S. military did some war games, like what would happen if we tried to invade Iran? And apparently, the U.S. general who was playing Iran, just sort of thought outside of the box a little bit and destroyed the entire U.S. Navy. And it's been obvious for a very long time that the idea of the U.S. Navy and its aircraft carriers attempting to compete with China on China's, not just China, on Iran, even Iran, attempting to compete with them within 20 to 30, 40 miles of the Chinese coastline is madness. And I think, Taiwan is at the closest point, it's what, 90 miles off of Taiwan? It's insane. The U.S. Navy is useless. So if Taiwan is to be defended from China, it would have to be done by the Taiwanese on Taiwanese land. However, there has been not much attention paid to the flip side of that. China is uninvadable with much cheaper equipment than a U.S. aircraft carrier. Has made itself uninvadable. I think that Taiwan has the potential to make itself uninvadable by China with the same technologies. And I think that's an aspect that I think needs to be more examined and more. The problem, of course, and I think this is a way that destroyers, and this is the reason why we still make surface ships for the U.S. Navy at all, is that the actual technologies involved in defending a ship from missiles are some of the most classified, hyper secret things in the U.S. military. So maybe it's too difficult to have a real analysis of what actually goes on here. But my hunch is that if the Taiwan Strait is unpassable for U.S. military ships, then Taiwan can also make it unpassable for Chinese military ships and carriers. So yeah, I think that Taiwan is absolutely in danger, and I do wonder, like, if not now, when is China going to try and take back Taiwan? Because it's been 70 years now, and every year wears on, and Taiwan becomes more independent in its culture and outlook, and China begins to stagnate, which I think is a dynamic that we're arguably already experiencing. So yeah, it's definitely something to worry about, but I think it's not quite as straightforwardly dangerous for Taiwan as has been indicated. Questions. Local Extreme says, More Freedom Foundation, throughout 2020, you made only one video on Saudi Arabia. Was this a conscious decision, or did nothing interesting happen to Saudi Arabia? I made at least 2 videos on Saudi Arabia. I made one about their oil war, and I made one about what Joe Biden would think. I can't believe I only made 2 videos about Saudi Arabia logo. Holy shit. That's surprising, frankly. It's also might be why my channel's not doing so well, because covering Saudi Arabia is a big deal. A problem for me in Saudi Arabia is that I have been writing an absolutely monstrous, this is why I haven't covered Yemen anywhere near as much as I should have. I've been writing for now over 8 months. I've been writing a monstrous video entitled Saudi Arabia Has Lost the Yemeni War of Independence, going through the history of Yemeni-Saudi relations for like 60 years. That has been my next video on Saudi Arabia for like 8 months now. And I think I've gotten caught up in making this video too long or being too daunted by how long it is. I just need to get that out. And then once I get that out, I think I've got like 3 other videos on Saudi Arabia that'll come in quick succession. But that is the most important thing for me about Saudi Arabia, is ending the war in Yemen. And I've just taken too long to get that video. I mean, 2020 is also, from video production perspective, 2020 has also been a great year of distractions. I've been homeless for most of it. I've been dealing with family illness, and also everything in the world is, been kind of disastrous. I mean, what I'd expected to do with 2020 was really dive in on my Avoiding the British Empire series and illustrating parallels between the British Empire and the US government. As you can see, that did not happen. But my hope is, and honestly, I mean, with the success that we've been having on Patreon this month, I haven't mentioned it, it's been fantastic. There've been like 25 people who've signed up, which may not sound like much, but makes a huge difference in sort of my potential standard of living. Like, I will be, at this point, be able to get an apartment of my own that I will stay in for quite some time. That's sort of something I'm hoping to put together for early 2021 right now. And that will make it a lot easier, allow me to produce things that I want to produce more regularly and with more predictability. So there's that. Oh, I noticed there's a super chat, and I'm tremendously grateful. Brando Commando says, Putin did an interview where he said he believes Turkey and Russia can fix relations like France and Germany did after World War II through de Gaulle and Adenauer. Do you see any of this happening, or is it wishful thinking? I absolutely see this happening, and I have a video talking about this happening that is 4 years old. 5 years old now. It says that Russia will join the EU within the 30 years. Well, I am no longer as confident as I was back then that the European Union will still exist in 30 years' time. I absolutely believe that Russia and Turkey will come to an accommodation with the EU in general. I think that they're already vastly more intertwined with the European Union than France and Germany were at any point before de Gaulle and Adenauer. And honestly, then probably Turkey and Russia are more intertwined with France and Germany at this point than they were after 20 years then Germany were intertwined with each other after 20 years of de Gaulle and Adenauer. I mean, de Gaulle and Adenauer, we're now talking, that's 70 years ago. I absolutely see that happening, not because of some kind of belief in natural, the beauties of the European Union and tra la la kumbaya hopping down the street together. I believe it because of this multipolar world that is emerging, and I believe that, it's funny, I hadn't really thought about this so much when I made that video 5 years ago, arguing that Russia was going to join with the EU. Or at least, whatever the post-EU alliance is, I was very much focused on China and the massive, extraordinary threats that China poses to the EU. But certainly after the Trump administration, I think that the EU and Russia and Turkey are going to think a lot more seriously about the threats that the United States poses to them. I don't believe that, the Europe, unless things fuck up pretty dramatically, Trump comes back in 2024, which is totally possible, and is surrounded by more competent anarchists. I don't believe that we're gonna see in my lifetime the breakup of NATO or Europe being like consciously anti the United States. But I think that the EU is already thinking about, okay, how do we make ourselves a bigger player in this sort of nightmare sandpit with China, the United States, maybe India one day. Gosh, even Africa looks a little, the chances of some higher degree of African coordination and independence look possible. I think that it's not that Russia and Turkey and the EU are going to just decide that we're pals because of civilization and society. It's about banding together in a storm, and I think that I do think it is the natural future of Russia and Turkey to gravitate further towards the EU. Of course, for that to happen, like the EU has to figure out its economy some way. Which we haven't seen for, 12 years. That means they need to figure out how to get back to growth. Daniel Casada asks, when will Maduro get kicked out of Venezuela? Well, I don't know that, but I do know that the chances of Maduro getting kicked out of Venezuela are much higher under Biden than they were under Trump. Because as I pointed out in a video, like how Trump keeps saving Maduro, Trump provided such a cartoon villain. Just the talk about fantasies becoming real, like the leftist stereotype of the American president. Like Trump became that in the most direct way possible. He's just evil, grasping capitalism defined, and with such a fantastic enemy for Maduro to fight against. He'd been saying forever, it's capitalist, imperialist bastards from America. And then America went and elected Donald Trump. It was an incredible gift to Maduro, a guy who had destroyed his country. So I think actually, as with the Iranian theocracy, it's actually a letting up of U.S. pressure that will allow these very oppositional, these countries, the government of Iran, the government of Venezuela, they thrive on U.S. opposition. It's obviously horrible for the U.S. people. It's obviously horrible for the people of Venezuela and Iran and Syria. The U.S. has gotten very good at brutalizing the peoples of these countries, but it's fantastic for the leadership. Maximum pressure is how you keep these people in power. So to the extent that Biden does relieve some of that pressure, I think the chances of Maduro falling become much higher. Questions. If you add a super chat to your question, I will absolutely answer your question. It's an interesting question. Artuayu Artibian asks, what do you think of pineapple pizza? I'm kind of okay with it. I'm not a big um, not a big fan. Like I'll eat it, but I tend to more lean towards sort of plain or sort of tomatoes and garlic. If anybody's wondering, Chicago deep dish pizza is not pizza. There actually is something called Detroit deep dish pizza, which is extraordinary. I've only ever had it in Traverse City, Michigan. But if you're in Traverse City, Michigan, you've got to go get the Detroit style pizza. And presumably it's on offer in Detroit as well. It's amazing. But I've never really been a big fan of pineapples on my pizza. I'll eat it, but I don't have any distinct, it's not what I seek out. Logo Cool Extreme asks, how has the EU survived the coronavirus, being as shaky as it is? I mean, is Malta on the chat today? He's made the case that the EU is much stronger than I thought it was, and he thinks the salad days are here again. I think that the EU has survived much more than I expected it would. In 2015, 2016, 2017, it was just like, holy shit, like, you've got this refugee crisis that the U.S. imposed on them, and then you've got the Brexit thing that came out of the refugee crisis the U.S. imposed on them. Like, is the U.S. The EU couldn't possibly survive all this, and yet they keep going. I think my last video on the European Union was I did one on sanctions. God, man, this year has just been such a haven't covered as much as I would have liked to this year. It's interesting because I saw something Hafiz Farouk was saying that I don't cover the Eurasia much. I used to cover Europe all the time, but I think I pointed out maybe in 2018 that folks were like, "Oh, the EU is saved," because the EU managed to hit like 2% growth in a year or something like that. And I remain very convinced that the European Union is quite shaky. But what I think I underestimated is the degree to which people in the European Union are committed to the European Union. I think 49% of the British really wanted to stay in it, and most everybody else in Europe is more committed than not. In some cases, it's pure bribery. In Eastern Europe, the Polish government, the Hungarian government love to talk shit about the European Union all the time, but they, as soon as they get into power, they stop talking about leaving because the amount of money I think that the EU provides to poorer countries is pretty massive. But I think there's also a real consciousness in Europe of just how horrifying their history has been. And that the EU project, no matter how mismanaged, no matter how disastrous it's been in some respects, is worth continuing. And I think that's something that I underestimated, was the degree to which people were committed to the EU, even in the face of extraordinary failure. I mean, poor Italy, basically since the euro came in what was it, 2000, Italy has not grown, like economically speaking. It has so clearly been extraordinarily disastrous for them. Yet they just keep on being committed to the European Union, and I think that's a sign of just how aware European. Maybe this isn't based on anything other than my hunch. Maybe it's that Europeans, sort of in a base level, understand just how horrific European history was before the European Union, and are committed to maintaining a more peaceful continent. That's my take on why the EU has survived. And it is that's why I actually, in some senses, I don't focus on it as much. Find myself enraged at the people in Brussels, because I mean, this extraordinary commitment that Europeans have given to them, and it hasn't been a great. Yeah, the U.S. has screwed them over, but it has not been a great record for the EU over the past 2 decades. Admittedly, not all their fault, but they could have done better, and they should do better. Commander Red says, More Freedom Foundation, do you think more countries will teach Mandarin as a second language as opposed to English? And how will this affect the soft power of China? One of the great gifts that the United States has been given is the English language, and the fact that compared to Mandarin, It is, it's an idiosyncratic, a frustrating, irritating language. I know there's a ton of people who speak English as a second language on here. I'm sure it's been a tremendous pain in the ass to learn. However, comparing that to Mandarin, it's essentially, I have met people who have, with a tremendous amount of leisure and commitment throughout their educations, I have met people from other countries who have become fluent to a degree in Mandarin. It is a language of what, a couple thousand characters. I know there's more simplified versions that you can learn, but whereas English, anybody in the world can become extraordinarily capable in English. I worked at a law firm in Turkey where I certainly had, the best, as I was the only native English language speaker, had the best, written and spoken English. However, when it came to the mastery of legal English, the mastery of a contract or this, that, and the other thing, I was always worlds behind almost everybody else in the office. So the thing about Mandarin is, yes, it's possible to become conversational in it. As a non-Chinese person, it is possible to even get up to the facility you need for business purposes. But man, it's extraordinarily difficult. In the English language, some of our greatest writers, I think what Vladimir Nabokov and Joseph Conrad are certainly ones that stick in my mind, are sort of old classics. Some of our greatest writers are people who did not speak English as a first language. We're very lucky. That's an aspect, one of many aspects of competition with China, where the United States is just naturally, operating from a higher platform. My understanding is Mandarin is beautiful. My understanding is Mandarin is, super classy and impressive, and I have endless respect for those who have, for anybody, for Chinese people who figured out how to make that work, and certainly for people who did not grow up with the language who figured out how to make it work. But it's a real difficult thing to do. And sort of, I feel like, most of the people I knew, Spanish is something, if you're fairly educated in the United States, you probably picked up, to some degree. French used to be more like that. These are languages you can, and you can just sort of pick up. Mandarin is not something you can just pick up. And I think that's a tremendous advantage that the United States has. Okay, questions. No more super chat. Well, I suppose if I'm doing 4 live presentations in a month, I shouldn't expect so many super chats. But questions. Hafiz Farouk says, "My bet Arabic will beat English. Your thoughts?" I don't know, man. There's this thing called the first mover advantage, and I think that, well, actually, yeah, Arabic totally beat English. Arabic, long before anybody in England anybody in England was, long before there were like more than 1,000 literate people in England, long before modern English developed, Arabic was a world language. It's kind of fascinating. I mean, just how far the Arabic script traveled when the Arabs conquered the known world, yeah, it was a huge deal. But that advantage slipped away. It's interesting. Turkey, the Turkish language was expressed chiefly in Arabic script until the 1920s, when Ataturk switched Turkey over to the Latin script. So what's happened now is that things have gotten tremendously locked in. What's a very interesting aspect of the 20th century that's underappreciated is that the world became literate. Turkey had a Persian script up until the 1920s, but up until the 1920s, I mean, Turkish literacy of the public was, 15%, or I don't know what it was exactly. But it strikes me that it wasn't more than 20%, if I recall correctly. Yeah. So, sorry, and since Turkey adopted the Latin script, this is because of infinite number of factors. But Turkish literacy today is something like 98%. So, every person in Turkey has learned to read on the Latin script. They will teach their children the Latin script. I think there are many, committed religious people in Turkey learn to read the Quran in Arabic. But as a general thing, and that's not just in Turkey, that's everywhere. For a long time now, if you wanted to conduct business in the world, you had to speak English. If you wanted to travel, you had to speak English. What's fascinating is even with the UK leaving the European Union, I think a lot of the practical day-to-day, I'm sure that I'm not sure that English will no longer be the official language. The EU always had multiple official languages of business with French and German and all manner of things. And I'm sure there'll be some sort of effort to boot English out of official EU communications. But when diplomats meet to hash things out in Brussels for decades and decades to come, they'll still be speaking English. If the worst, if the absolute worst forecasts of the end of U.S. empire come about, we'll all be dead in nuclear holocaust. But if, say, it's completely easy and the U.S. fucks something up, and 10 years from now, the U.S. doesn't matter at all in the world, and for whatever reason, just say that happens, the world will still be speaking English primarily for another century. If there were by some strange circumstance, China became as dominant as the US is, or some Arabic country became as dominant as the United States is today, and maintained it for a century, then yeah, I think at that point, whatever language that country spoke would become the lingua franca. The thing is, I don't believe that any country will be able to become as dominant as the United States has become after the United States, because I do think that there's been certain aspects of power and knowledge and wealth that have been spread around the world in such a way that makes that kind of hegemonic possibility no longer possible. I could be entirely wrong about that, but that is my hunch. So yeah, I think language is probably, for the rest of my life anyway, English is going to be the main language. Wow, local extremes going hard. Is it offensive for me to, wrong for me to suggest that the priority given to Holocaust, Irish famine, and the Armenian genocide is a form of white privilege? Not at all. It's absolutely a form of white privilege, for sure. But I would also argue that caring about those sorts of things, Armenian genocide, Nazi Holocaust, Irish famine, that's interesting, who gets the name on each of those. In my mind, not anybody else's. I think that those things are absolutely focused on more than the Rwanda genocide, the horrors of Congo in the 90s, what happened to the Azeris in the 90s. Those things are all absolutely emphasized more, and there are absolutely elements of racism and white privilege in the fact that those particular horrors are emphasized more. But I think it has been such an incredibly positive thing for the world in general that those things be emphasized, that's not the right thing to focus your ire about white privilege. Yeah, 100%. The fact that we care so much about what the nasty Germans did to the poor Jews has to do with the fact that everybody in that equation is a white person. But because we care so much about what happened with the Holocaust, it means that the world in general, because let's face it, the sort of European, North American, used to be more lily white world, has held the balance of power for the past couple centuries in the world. The fact that we did care so much about those things meant that other horrors, other catastrophes were paid attention to as well. And I think that's tremendously worthwhile. That is not something to be What's the word I'm looking for here? That is not something to be lamented or there are many, many things that we should care about, white privilege and Eurocentrism and many things that we should focus on, correcting in that regard. I feel like the fact that we care more about when white people are genocided is bad, but I am happier that we care at all about people getting genocided. So yeah, I think those are probably not the right targets for complaining about white privilege. Pirate King says, your view on Necmettin Erbakan and his legacy. I think that Erbakan's legacy, because you get into that, it's sort of like, what's my take on, and that's kind of interesting. So Necmettin Erbakan, for those of you who don't know, is sort of the predecessor to Erdogan as the standard bearer of respect for religion in Turkey. But what's interesting about Necmettin Erbakan is that he was universally respected, not for his politics. He actually was forced out of government in a postmodern coup in 1997. But he was respected as a professor, I think he was an engineer. I think he was known as erudite and well-spoken and this, that, and other thing. So he's sort of like the William F. Buckley to Erdogan's Donald Trump. And it's fascinating because I would have, even though I think Rifat was at the Welfare Party, was Erbakan's party, that was pushed out of government in 1997. I think Erbakan died. I mean, I don't believe he's with us anymore. But what's interesting is that you can have a sort of more respectable precursor, and it's also an interesting indicator of if the Turkish military hadn't forced Erbakan out of government in 1997, then the Turkish Religious Party would have owned the Turkish banking crisis of 2000. And Erdogan could have perhaps been missed entirely. So I don't actually think it's a bad thing that Turkey has had worked through this sort of religious pathology through Erdogan's time in power. I think it's good that folks who thought that Islam hadn't been respected enough in Turkish history got their guy to sort of win and sort of work through that in the Turkish mindset and whatnot. I think that's a very good thing that happened. I think it would have been better if Erbakan had been allowed to keep power in 1997. He would have been the guy who I think everything would have been stabler and everything would have been better handled. But I don't know. Maybe I have too rosy a picture of who Erbakan was, and I'm sure that's in retrospect, of course, right? Like if I were talking to an educated Western-focused liberal Turk in 2004 about Erbakan, this kind of person who'd tell me now that, well, of course, Erbakan, he was the respectable Islamist. He was a good politician. He wasn't some populist rabble rouser. If I talked to that same person in 2000 or 2001, 2002, they'd been like, "Oh, fuck Erbakan, he's evil monster." So it's interesting how that works. I have another super chat, and again from Brando Commando. I didn't miss any other ones, did I? That's thank you. That's very generous. Again, I'm getting the sun in my face. There were no other super chats, right? Nope, just Brando Commando and Brando Commando. Very grateful for. Is the so-called Pax Americana, Brando Commando asks, is the so-called Pax Americana threatened? Oh my gosh, so many comments. I'm losing. There we go. Is the so-called Pax Americana threatened by increasing Chinese colonialism / imperialism, as the neocons, neolibs think it is? Is it stronger or collapsing slower than the Pax Britannica did after World War II? Okay, so that's a fascinating multi-level question there. First off, is it stronger or collapsing slower than the Pax Britannica did after World War II? I would argue that the Pax Britannica began to collapse during World War I. In my book, I say it's pretty much In 1917, basically, the British, after the Russians and the French had already run out of money very early on in World War I, and the British had been funding the Turkish and excuse me, that was wrong. The Turkey was against the British in World War I. The Ottoman Empire, which was the predecessor to Turkey. So in 1917, the British were carrying the Russian and French war efforts financially, and then they finally ran out of basically credit in New York. They ran out of the ability to get more money. And at that point, the U.S. government under Woodrow Wilson, before it, I actually, no, wait, maybe I think this was the point at which they declared war, basically said, okay, we're in the war, we're on your side, and then started bankrolling the war. I would argue that the Pax Britannica started falling apart at that point, not after World War II. I think that the whole period of the 1920s and the 1930s, though there are many people who would disagree with me on that. I mean, people would argue that actually the world system was kind of working in the 1920s. It was only the nightmare of the Great Depression that sort of brought Hitler to power that had things falling apart. But yeah, I don't know. I generally see the Pax Britannica as having been ending with World War I. So if you're asking, at the current moment, is the Pax Americana as weak and falling apart as the Pax Britannica after World War II? Absolutely not. The Pax Americana is in, and for those, so Pax Americana, this is a play on words for the Pax Romana, the famous period between Augustus and the 3rd century crisis in the Roman Empire, where I think it was Edward Gibbon, who was a British guy writing in the 1700s, said that, you know, the best period of time in human history was the time of the 4 good emperors in you know, between what is it? Sort of the 120s and the 180s in the Common Era in the Roman Empire, where it was sort of peace was maintained and trade and flourishing, yada yada. Folks talk about the past 70 years of you know, post World War II era as the Pax Americana, or, you know, debatable. You know, was that, you know, a post Cold War thing, what have you? So the Pax Americana exists very much. Is it threatened by increasing Chinese colonialism, imperialism, as the neocons and neolibs think it is? As with Britain, I would say that, as with the Pax Britannica, the Pax Americana is principally threatened by the actions of the person named in the concept, of the entity named in the concept. The Pax Americana is the Pax Britannica, as I maintained in my book, Avoiding the British Empire, available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle form. In Avoiding the British Empire, the Pax Britannica was destroyed by Britain, and the Pax Americana is in the process of being destroyed by the United States government in really obvious, stupid actions like the destruction of Iraq, Libya, Syria, and also in less widely seen things. The way that the British killed their you know, time of peace and prosperity, and the way that the United States is killing its time of peace and prosperity, is through power grabs. And the power grabs that the United States are making are not always as obvious as our occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. They are legal. I've talked about FATCA on this channel. I've talked about sanctions on this channel. I should definitely talk more about both, because it's a fascinating aspect of what's going on. I talked about that, I think, a fair amount in a video just last Tuesday. I talked about how all these legal aspects of U.S. empire are actually pissing people off to the point where they might band together against us. I think that China is the most obvious standard bearer for fighting against you know, the U.S. world system. I don't think it's, you know, devious actions that the Chinese make. I think they're just naturally going to sit there as the person who is, sorry, not the person, these are countries, these are entities, as the entity most likely to hold on, as the entity most likely to be the pole around which opposition to the United States centers. But that's because of U.S. actions. That's not because of Chinese actions. And I think as I've talked a lot about on the channel, I think one incredible thing that we've benefited from over the past 4 years of Trump is that the Chinese utterly failed to recognize the extraordinary opportunity that Trump provided to them. They reacted to Trump's childishness and brutality and ineffectiveness with their own childishness, brutality, and ineffectiveness, with less ineffectiveness than Trump, admittedly. But yeah, they haven't really impressed anybody. I just noticed there's an ongoing European Chinese negotiation over some sort of trade deal. I have not looked into the minutia of that. I guess earlier this week, or was it last week? It looked like that trade deal. Well, it's Monday, so it was last week. It looked like that trade deal definitely wasn't happening because Europe was enraged by Xinjiang and the sort of ongoing cultural genocide that China is enacting there. And then the news this morning is that actually, no, wait, the EU might be ready to sign that deal. So I don't know. But the question is not, has it been, devious manipulation by the Chinese that has created this situation? It's not that. It's actually devious. Not devious. It's out loud and some more subtle, extraordinary fuck-up power grabs that the United States has engaged in that have created this situation. All right, that is my answer to that question. Do we have any more super chats? Did I miss one? I did not. Okay, questions. Reginald Huggington. That's a fantastic name, Reginald. Why is no one talking about the Caesar Act? Your channel is the first place I've heard about it, even though it seems huge. The Caesar Act, to be clear, is the horrifying population-crushing sanctions that the United States imposed on Syria, not 10 years ago, but this year. Why is nobody talking about sanctions? Because too much of US media is oriented around this idea that the US government is good, not just US media, but world media, and anything the US government does is fine. Is it insane and outrageous that in the era of Trump, that people still take that approach? Absolutely. It's insane. It's outrageous. We are doing more with the Caesar sanctions to brutalize and immiserate the Syrian population than Bashar Assad ever did. It is disgusting. It is horrifying what we're doing. And I don't do more content on it because I just don't have the mental bandwidth to do so. And I guess even I've incorporated that there's just a certain level of horror that we're all becoming accustomed to. And that's quite sad. But yeah, you're absolutely right. People should be paying more attention to the Caesar Act. I don't think you'll find it on YouTube, but if you just go to Google and type in Syria Caesar Act, you can find many more knowledgeable and more committed activists talking about this horror. Go to the second page because the New York Times and the Washington Post will tell you, actually, it's fine. Or maybe they'll be, once a year, they'll run an op-ed saying, is starving the Syrian people to death such a great idea? They'll run on the opinion page, and then everything else will be all for it. But yeah, no, I think you point out a good fact. I think you make a very valid point that everybody should be talking about what we're doing to these poor people more. The sort of approach of oh, this place has a nasty government, so I'm going to starve their people to death. I'm going to make it, in a pandemic year, I'm going to make it impossible for them to find the funding for medical treatment. It's heartless. It's evil. It is what my country is doing to Iran. It is what my country is doing to Syria. It is what my country is doing to Yemen. I mean, Saudi Arabia takes the lead on that, but we support them all the way. It is disgusting. Yeah, I think I've put up videos saying, U.S. Iran policy is evil, and so are the Caesar sanctions against Syria. I don't have the dedication necessary to make one cause my thing. I just like looking at everything, and I don't really know that my audience would want me to do that either. But there absolutely are people, if you're interested, there are people out there who are much more knowledgeable than I am about these sanctions and are committed to opposing them. You can support them with time, you can support them with money, you can support them with just learning more about it and telling your friends. It's very important work to do. More Freedom Foundation asks a very good question. Does Erdogan actually want to overthrow Assad? He knows what are the consequences of turning Syria into Somalia, right? That's a very interesting question. I think Erdogan initially, when the Obama administration convinced him it'd be an easy win for everybody, initially definitely wanted to overthrow Assad. Now, however, that Turkey has troops on the ground, Turkey has a public that's real sick of taking in refugees, I think that Erdogan's calculations have no doubt changed. I think Erdogan and Turkey are most concerned with making certain that there isn't a Kurdish state on their southern border, and even more importantly, that there isn't a Kurdish state affiliated with the PKK, a terrorist organization that I believe actually the US still recognizes as a terrorist organization, even though we've been working with them. That's never stopped the US military before. See Yemen, Syria, Idlib, lots of other places. Lost track of what I was saying, which makes sense because we're almost 2 hours in. But yeah, so I don't think Erdogan really, I think there's a very obvious deal that will be made at some point over the next decade. It'd be great if it was made now, where the US leaves Syria, the Kurds of northern Syria, the SDF or the YPJ or affiliated with the PKK, all these acronyms have actually always worked pretty well with Assad. So if they agree to work again with Assad, it's only the US that gets in the way of that. Then Turkey can probably, as long as it's not a border with Kurdistan that they're expected to take, they can probably hopefully pull out of Syria as well. I mean, that's the deal that the US, the only purpose for the US remaining in Syria is to prolong the destruction of the Syrian civil war. That's the whole purpose. They'll tell you like, oh, we're here to block Iran. Well, you know what? Iran is a historic ally of Syria. The way that my government is blocking Iran in Syria is by maintaining the destruction and the horror that is going on in Syria. That is, when they say, oh, we're here to block Iran, that's what we're doing. That's fine. That's good. We're blocking Iran in Syria. To block Iran in Syria, the US strategy is to keep the war going and starve the Syrian people. That's how we're blocking Iran. So yeah, that's a thing. RTTU RTBN, as Tunisia's future seems mysterious and very unclear. What do you think? Also, what do you think of cucumbers and watermelons? I don't think about cucumbers and watermelons very much at all, I'll be honest. Tunisia, I don't like watermelon, actually. Cucumbers, I don't like much either. Anyway, future of Tunisia is something I really need to check in on. I've noticed the past couple of years, I've sort of started off by doing sort of reviews of Tunisia and what's going on there and this, that, and the other thing. And it's about time. We're coming into the new year. I should, I think I owe the channel and Tunisia and Algeria, Tunisia update and an Algeria update. I think I'm good on Libya. And I just don't know. I haven't done the relevant research recently. I hope to do so. Okay, I think we are closing in on, it is about, it's been almost 2 hours. That went quickly. I'm surprised, there's only one more live chat left this year. We'll be doing another live chat. I think it'll be an attempt at a forecast maybe on Wednesday. And yeah, I got a produced video that I got to finish producing for tomorrow. So it's kind of a crazy week. Yeah, that's what's going on. The reason I'm having this crazy week is I am desperate to convince more of you to sign up for my crowdfunding thing. I am tremendously grateful to everybody who participates in this channel at any level who comes to these live chats, who pays any attention, participates in any way, comments. It's awesome. It's fantastic. However, I do need to eat. I do need to live in a place. This year's been pretty disjointed because I've primarily been living on my parents' couches in Michigan and Connecticut. I need to be making a little bit more money if I'm gonna do the things I'd like to do with this channel. I think over the past month, it's been fantastic. Like really, I mean, we've gone from, I think I've gone from making U.S. minimum wage to making a little bit more than minimum wage, which is, well, to significantly more than minimum wage over the past month. The Patreon contributions have popped up a bunch, and I'm super, super grateful. That's really cool. But I would like them to go more because making significantly more than minimum wage is not a lot for a 41-year-old with multiple degrees in the United States. However, I also get the best job in the world, which is just trying to learn things and communicate things. And I'm tremendously grateful to everyone who's signed up on Patreon. I would like more people to do so, which is why I'm doing all these live chats this week. If you do sign up, you get access to this month we're doing four public live chats. But every month we usually do one public live chat and one patrons only live chat, which is a lot of fun and tends to be as wide ranging as today's chat was. So it'd be great if you could sign up. And if you sign up in the next 3 days on Patreon, you get to vote on what my next big project is, either Israel, Palestine, or Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, or US Empire. If you want to continue this conversation all week long, you can find me at, at Rabolaw on Twitter. That's Twitter. And you can find me on Instagram at The Golden Age. So yeah, you can check me out there. We have a lot more fun on Twitter. I think Golden Age I've just been using as sort of promotional stuff for videos. It can be fun as well. If I ever travel again, I tend to do more ruminations on places that I travel to on Twitter, on Instagram. That can be fun. But yeah, you can follow me there. You can purchase books that I have. I'm going to keep spieling until I end, but if there's super chats, if there are more super chats, I will definitely respond to those. So yeah. Yeah, so there's the Twitter, the Instagram, the Patreon. Please sign up. You can also make donations on PayPal. I noticed that someone did as we were doing this, which is fantastic. Please subscribe. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Please watch my videos. It's been interesting. Maybe it's because I've been so focused on fundraising. Not very many people have been watching my videos this month. Hopefully this push of live videos at the end of the month will jack that up. But YouTube has become less willing to put forward content from truly independent creators. They made a decision around the beginning of this year. We were like, you know what? We're just going to send news and politics searches to CNN, Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, more established stuff. So really, like, for me to grow this channel, I'm tremendously grateful that there's like a loyal following. I mean, it's amazing that we have 100. We've never had less than 100 people. Well, I guess we just dipped under 100 people watching this live chat. That's fantastic. That's a real audience, and I'm tremendously grateful for it. But the only way this channel grows now is if you tell your friends about it. So tell your friends, because YouTube YouTube has decided that their model is no longer helped by the growth of smaller channels, or at least not smaller channels that focus on history and politics. One thing is that the amount of money I get means that I can spend more on advertising, which is kind of a lame thing to want to be spending money on. But it's kind of vital. If you ever wondered why, like Prager University, a sort of pretty dumb right-wing channel, has millions of views for every video. Well, it's interesting because they got millions of views for every video. So, maybe their average video is seen 1,000 more times than mine, but they've only got like twice as many comments, and the reason behind that is because they just pour a ton of money into advertising. And a lot of that is views that are meaningless. But eventually, it does add up. So if I had more money, after I get enough money to feed myself regularly and have an apartment, I could be able to put more money into advertising and sort of growing the channel more that way. I'm much happier to continue to grow organically, but I do think it is. I think this content is worthwhile, and it is worth putting a little more money into advertising to get it in front of more people. I think that's all of my pitching. No more. Oh yeah, no, 100%. Leo Tuzo, PragerU is buying clicks. But what's interesting is that there's the illegal buying clicks, but there's also Google, through its AdWords platform, gives you the opportunity to buy clicks. You just advertise yourself. You might notice that on YouTube search. You can, oh, this is paid for advertising, and I do that on a very small scale. Maybe put $20 on a video every now and again, and it has an effect, and more people see it, and it works. All right. Logo Cool Extreme says, after your U.S. Empire vid, it shot up to the top of your Patreon poll, despite having less views among the three, the least views among the three. Will you acknowledge the electoral fraud happening in the polls? If there's electoral fraud, it is orchestrated by the very select 113-person electorate that are my patrons. And I think you'll notice that still half of the patrons have not voted. I think there's a distinct chance that some of them just aren't interested in this at all and are kind of annoyed that they're getting all these emails this month. But I think there's probably a few people who are just waiting until the end to pile on with their votes. There could be another change, who knows? So that's why if you're particularly invested in any of these topics, it's in your interest to sign up on Patreon. All right, even I'm getting annoyed with the amount of shilling I'm doing here. Thank you, RTYU, RTBN, for your virtual donation of flying dollar bills. Okay, well, thank you all so much. It has been just about 2 hours. If there's a super chat, I'm so mercenary. If there's a super chat, I'm happy to keep talking, but I think I'm about done here. That's a great question, that True Realist. Do you think Algeria, Sudan, and Libya would follow in Tunisia democracy, or will Tunisia fall back into dictatorship due to economic woes? I think either of those are very plausible possibilities. I think that, either one of those things could easily happen. I think that the US and Europe, one of our most extraordinarily stupid things that the US and Europe did was first destroying Libya and then just letting it stagnate in disaster for years. Tunisia has provided a sterling democratic example for almost a decade now. I think it is actually it is a huge part of how shaky Algeria's ruling military junta looks now. And if there had just been stability in Libya, I think there would have been real motion towards the kind of system that Tunisia has created. So I don't know, but yeah, either thing could happen. I think Tunisians are really unhappy because they have not gotten any kind of economic rewards for the sacrifices. It's just been all sacrifice under democracy, and if you don't get any positive out of democracy, you're going to get sick of it. So yeah, either one of those possibilities is very possible. All right. I think I'm going to end the stream. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. You guys are the More Freedom Foundation, the only folks making this possible. And this was fun. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. Oh, God damn it. Another one. Brando Commando with another super chat. Quick thoughts on U.S. COVID stimulus. I think that it's probably good stimulus is very good. I think that it's almost a cliche on Twitter now how underappreciated the amount of stimulus that the U.S. government has provided. In fact, the U.S. has been. It's not, we didn't just send out a $1,200 check. The U.S. has been tremendously generous to unemployed folks. I think that's at the root of stock market success and economic resilience in not just in the United States but in the world. I think China is having a surprisingly good export-driven 2020. Surprisingly good, it means that the Chinese economy has grown by 2%, the lowest since the Cultural Revolution. But the fact that it's grown at all, I think, has a lot to do with U.S. stimulus. And I think that it was undeniably useful that the U.S. Finally enacted some stimulus. It may have been later than it should have been. I think there's a lot of people who are going full on, this is with the caveat that I do not understand finance, who are going full on like, normally we have a deficit of $500 billion to $1 trillion, and everybody's freaking out about how this might lead to inflation. Well, this year we had a deficit of $3.5 trillion. That is, in a single year, the U.S. government spent $3.5 trillion more than it took in. And there's no sign of inflation. There's no sign of real economic consequences for this. And I think a lot of commentators are going, fuck it, let's spend all the money on everything. Apparently, the US government can borrow forever, and it's not a problem. And I think that's insane. I think that for sure, it's very clear that Obama screwed up in letting the Republicans get him obsessed about balanced budgets before the economic recovery had actually happened. I think that's true. I don't think anybody can dispute that anymore. I think that if Republicans start talking about balanced budgets next year, they should be run out of town on a rail. I think they're fools. However, this I do not think we should go. It's not. We're in this point. It seems like that we're coming into this mental point where it's like people are like zero or like millions and millions and millions, like zero or infinite. In terms of the amount of money that we can be providing. I think that we do have to make some kind of allowances for the fact that the main entity purchasing U.S. debt at this point seems to be the same entity. It seems to be the Federal Reserve. I don't know, man. I've never understood finance, but I am very suspicious of this new orthodoxy that we can spend all the money we want forever and ever. So I think that while the stimulus that was enacted this month was probably appropriate, and there will probably need to be more stimulus over the coming year, I do think some actual analysis of some actual attempts to get our finances back somewhere close to the world of the rational is worthwhile. Jack Hawkins with another super chat. Here we go. What do you think of the Chinese initiating border clashes with India while now buying India rice to feed the folk? Man, I don't know. I'm not aware of buying India rice to feed the folk. That's certainly very generous. I think that the Chinese border clashes with India are just insane. There was the Ladakh stuff earlier this year, and I think back in 2017 as well. Though, I don't know enough about either interaction to say that definitively that it was China's fault. Regardless, even if it was India being the aggressor, is a really dumb thing. That was sort of, I think, my main video talking about China's missed opportunity was sponsored by Ladakh. If you want to see me, just type in Mo Freedom Foundation Ladakh into the search entity, and that'll talk about just this incredible Trump opportunity that Turkey has just whiffed. This incredible Trump opportunity that China has just whiffed at about 2 hours and 10 minutes. The mind, it doesn't work the way it used to. So, Yeah, I think that China's getting into border clashes with India. Jack Hawkins says that it was China initiated. Dumb, real dumb. Um, and I think with my analysis of China's leadership just being stupid, I think I'm being a little unfair in that I'm not acknowledging what a um, um, what a difficult, what's the word I'm looking for here? Um, Not acknowledging what a difficult problem the Chinese government is facing, because now that the economy is not going on as many cylinders as it used to, the Chinese government has to justify itself with nationalism. And if it's justifying itself with nationalism, then well, there's problems. Well, that means that they have to act out in nationalist ways, which means they have to talk shit about Taiwan. They have to do stuff in the South China Sea, and starting fights with India is actually kind of a low cost way for China to do low cost way for China to do nationalism. Of course, the potential costs, nuclear war, are extreme and horrific. But it seems like China thinks it can get away with that sort of thing to make its public happy. But then that makes the world very unhappy, and sort of the squandering of that opportunity. Okay, I think that's. I'm now becoming less and less coherent. Unless there's a super chat like now, I think I'm probably done. Again, my name is Robert Morris. Every Tuesday, I have videos at the Mo Freedom Foundation. I would encourage you to subscribe. I would encourage you to follow me on Twitter at RoboLaw, or on Instagram at The Golden Age. My branding is not very consistent. Consider checking out one of the books I have written on Amazon. You can Everybody's Lying About Islam and Avoiding the British Empire, as well as FATCA, The New Birth of American Empire, are all available in both paperback and ebook form. I think that's everything I've got. I think, which is good, because I think I'm slowly making less and less sense. Thank you all for being here. You guys are the best. And here we go. End stream. End. There we go. Okay.